Good day. A week or so ago, I did a program about a visit of a Taliban delegation to Moscow and of the high-level talks that took place between that delegation and senior officials of the Russian Foreign Ministry, and I analysed in some detail the readout of those negotiations which the Russian Foreign Ministry has published. I pointed out that the Russians appeared to be working hard in anticipation of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan to broker a deal whereby the Taliban would agree to set up an inclusive and broad-based government with a view to bringing stability to the whole of Afghanistan and to ending the prolonged wars which have been taking place in that country ever since 1979, when the United States first initiated support for the Mujahideen movement, which was at that time in rebellion against the Afghan government, which was at that time left-wing and Soviet-backed. I also said that as part of these negotiations, the Russians would have made known to the Taliban certain red lines that Russia has. Above all, they wanted a commitment from the Taliban that Afghanistan, if it came under their rule, would not become a sanctuary or a launch pad for jihadi terrorist movements like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which might threaten neighbouring states, the Central Asian republics that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, especially, but also ultimately Russia and China. And I also said in that video that in the event that the Taliban were prepared to give those kind of undertakings to provide peace in Afghanistan by establishing a broad-based government there and by also promising not to allow Afghanistan to become a sanctuary for jihadi terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, then Afghanistan might gradually be integrated in the Eurasian institutions being created by China and Russia, and might also stand to benefit with economic aid, especially from China, in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, that was the negotiation that took place in Moscow, and by all accounts, the Taliban proved very receptive to all the points the Russians were making. They apparently gave the Russians a promise that they would indeed seek to establish a broad-based government in Afghanistan, which would bring stability and peace to the country and end the long Afghan wars, and that this government would also ensure that Afghanistan would not become a sanctuary and a launch pad for jihadi terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and would not also allow Afghanistan to remain a major producer of opium and drugs generally, which are trafficked to Europe via across Russia and Central Asia. So it looked as if that was a productive and effective negotiation, and one which might pave the way for further diplomatic contacts, leading ultimately towards a peace settlement. And I also said that it seemed to me as if the Russian objective was to try to broker talks between the Taliban and the current government, US-backed government in Kabul, with a view to negotiating the exit of that government from power and its replacement by what would inevitably a Taliban-led government, but a more broad-based government than the one that the Taliban established when it previously gained control of most of Afghanistan in the 1990s. Well, as I said, those negotiations seem to have gone well, and we can say now that they definitely did go well, because there has been an enormously important follow-up. And that is that a Taliban delegation has now gone to China, and it has met there with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Tianjin, and it has held what appear to have been productive talks with him, which appear to be derived or a follow-up to the previous talks in Moscow. Now, before I go into more detail about these talks, I get to say two things. Firstly, it is very interesting that the Afghan delegation met with Wang Yi and that they met with him in Tianjin. Now, in the video I have just published, just before this one, I discussed the visit of US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman to China and her negotiations there with senior Chinese officials. And I pointed out that though Wendy Sherman did meet with senior Chinese officials and did meet with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, it was striking that Wang Yi did not actually sit down at the negotiating table and talk with her. Wendy Sherman instead had to talk with other low-ranking officials, though of course still very senior officials in the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And of course this was justified by the Chinese on the basis that Wendy Sherman, since she is a Deputy Secretary of State and not the Secretary of State, the Secretary of State being of course Antony Blinken, because Wendy Sherman is only Deputy Secretary of State, she does not have full ministerial rank, and therefore that made it inappropriate for Wang Yi to engage her directly in negotiations, since she is not, in protocol terms, his equal. Well, how galling it must be for the Americans that in the very same city that Wendy Sherman was talking to senior officials of the Chinese government, that is to say in Tianjin, Wang Yi was talking directly after she left to a Taliban delegation. Note that no figure within this Taliban delegation is a foreign minister or indeed possesses ministerial rank in any government, and yet, of course, Wang Yi decided that the protocol problems did not exist in this case. He was perfectly happy to meet with this Afghan delegation and to do so one-to-one. And in fact, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has pointedly published photographs in which you see Wang Yi at a long table with the senior Taliban official who was heading this Taliban delegation to China. Now, it's difficult to see this particular episode, this treatment of the Taliban, directly after the previous treatment extended to Wendy Sherman, as anything other than a diplomatic snub. Whether it will be seen that way in Washington, whether the United States is capable of understanding that that is what the Chinese were doing, that in fact they were relegating Wendy Sherman to a lower status than the head of a Taliban delegation, I don't know. But the Chinese are masters of protocol, as everybody who's had to deal with them knows, and a snub undoubtedly is what this was. Anyway, that's one somewhat minor point. The other, perhaps more important point, is that this appears to have been a somewhat differently constituted delegation that the Taliban sent to China from the one which they sent to Moscow. Certainly the leaders of the delegation appear to be different people, but it is very clear that it is a direct follow-up of the Moscow talks. And we can say this with confidence because the Chinese in their reports are actually saying as much. And that is surprising, but perhaps not surprising if you consider the extent to which the Chinese and the Russians are working together, as it turns out, on Afghanistan and on a host of other issues. And as is usually the case now, Yuan gets a better sense of what is going on in the negotiations between China and the Taliban, not from the very brief statements and accounts that you find in the Foreign Ministry website, the Chinese Foreign Ministry website, or the rather anodyne discussions and reports that are published by the official Xinhua news agency, but rather from articles which appear in Global Times, the English language newspaper and website owned by the People's Daily, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of China, and therefore a media outlet which effectively and essentially sets out the thoughts and opinions of the Chinese leadership. And in fact, we have two articles about this visit of this Taliban delegation to China. One, which is written by the Global Times journal editorial team. It's not exactly an editorial, but we are told that it is written by GT, Global Times, staff reporters, which shows that this is a collective effort, and it is one, obviously, that has been approved by the editorial board of Global Times, and I strongly suspect at even higher level by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And a second article, which rather interestingly appears to be written by a gentleman called Daniil Bochkov, who perhaps from his name is Russian, it would certainly appear so, and who does indeed discuss the Russian angle of these talks for Global Times in a way that is clearly intended to confirm again that the Chinese and the Russians on Afghanistan are working together. Now, the article about the talks written by the Global Times staff reporters is quite long, but I will read it in some places and I will summarize it in others. Anyway, this is how it starts. China could play the role as a better mediator between the Afghan government and the Taliban for its smooth and high-level communication with both sides, whose peace talks may be stuck in stalemate for a long time, analysts said in response to an Afghan Taliban delegation's trip in Tianjin on Wednesday and its reiteration of a previous promise of never allowing any force to use the Afghan territory to endanger China. China reiterated that the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETHEREUM, is a UN-designated terrorist group and hopes that the Afghan Taliban will make a clear break with all terrorist organizations, including ETHEREUM, Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi said whilst meeting with a Taliban delegation from Afghanistan in Tianjin on Wednesday. Now, I should quickly say at this point that ETHEREUM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, is the organization which the Chinese government obviously refers to as a terrorist organization and which is so designated by the United Nations, which is challenging China's sovereignty and authority in Xinjiang province. All the things we've been reading about Xinjiang province, all the problems with the Uyghurs are connected to the Chinese concerns about the activities, the terrorist activities of ETHEREUM in Xinjiang province amongst the Muslim population there. So the Chinese have made it very clear to the Taliban that they want the Taliban to stamp out any manifestation of ETHEREUM in Afghanistan itself, that they do not want ETHEREUM to use Afghanistan as a sanctuary, and that they do not want ETHEREUM to be able to use Afghanistan as a launch pad for its militant and terrorist activities in Xinjiang. And we see that there has in fact been a promise from the Taliban that no such that ETHEREUM will not be allowed to use Afghanistan in that way, either as a sanctuary or as a launch pad in order to threaten China. Anyway, to continue, the meeting came after a Taliban delegation visited Moscow at the beginning of July. Analysts said instead of visiting other regional countries, the Taliban chose to first visit Russia and China, which shows it has recognized the two countries' previous efforts in promoting the peace process in Afghanistan and eyed a bigger role for them in a future reconstruction of the war-torn country. Now, actually, that's slightly mischievous because there has, in fact, been a Taliban delegation to Tehran, where the Taliban have had talks with the Iranian government. And that visit actually predated the visit to Moscow. So this report in Global Times that the Taliban have made their first visits to Russia and China ahead of those to other regional countries is actually not true. I'm sure the Chinese know this, but I think the point they're making in these kind of comments is that they want to emphasize that it is Russia and China working together that the Taliban need to deal with in order to stabilize Afghanistan and in order to build up Afghanistan and to consolidate their power and their government there. Anyway, to continue again, as an important military and political force in Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban is expected to play an important role in the peaceful reconciliation process in Afghanistan. We hope that the Afghan Taliban will put national interests first, hold high the banner of peace talks, establish the goal of peace, build a positive image, and pursue an inclusive policy, Wang said during the meeting. Now, that is, again, exactly the same advice. In fact, it's more than advice, as we'll see in a moment. It's the same advice that the Taliban received when they went to Moscow. The Russians, as I discussed in that previous video, told the Taliban that they must establish a broad-based, inclusive government, bringing together all the communities of the country in order to establish peace and stability throughout Afghanistan. And we see Wang Yi saying exactly the same thing. He says that the Afghan Taliban need to pursue a policy of peaceful reconciliation, and that they should put national interests first, hold high the banner of peace talks, establish the goal of peace, build a positive image, and pursue an inclusive policy. And note carefully the words that Global Times says Wang Yi used. He said that the Afghan Taliban is expected to play an important role in the peaceful reconciliation process. Now, that is not exactly a command. In fact, it is definitely less than a command. And the Chinese perhaps are not in the habit of giving orders to organizations like the Taliban, which the Taliban would almost certainly refuse to accept. But it is more than just a request or advice. It is telling the Taliban that this is the role they should play. It is the role they are expected to play. It is the role that China, Afghanistan's biggest and most powerful neighbor, by far expects the Taliban to play. And if the Taliban wants China as a friend, it needs to listen very carefully to this advice. So that's what that comment makes. Then it goes on to say the following. This is, again, I'm reading from the Global Times editorial. Wang noted that as Afghanistan's largest neighbour, China has always respected Afghanistan's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. The hasty withdrawal of US and NATO troops from Afghanistan marked the failure of US policy in Afghanistan, and it is an opportunity for the Afghan people to stabilize and develop their country. So this, again, is a pointed reminder from Wang Yi that China is Afghanistan's largest neighbor, and of course, by far its most powerful neighbor, and that China, unlike other great powers, the United States, Russia, Britain, has always respected Afghanistan's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. It's never sent its troops there. But that the US withdrawal now provides an opportunity, finally, to bring the long Afghan wars, which extend all the way back to the 1970s, to an end, and that the cause that should now be pursued is establishing stability and development in order to achieve a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan. It provides an opportunity for the Afghan people to stabilize and develop their country. Those are Wang Yi's words. And we then go on to read in the Global Times editorial that the situation in Afghanistan has entered a crucial period after the US pulled out most of its forces, and peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government are in stalemate, with both parties seeking a breakthrough. Against this backdrop, the Taliban delegation visited China to elaborate its stance and win China's support. And we also learn from other parts of the Global Times editorial that the members of the Taliban delegation to China showed their sincerity and goodwill to help China further understand them. For example, the representative from Religious Commission may explain the Taliban's changes on religious policy. And so the Chinese were impressed by the sincerity and goodwill that the Taliban delegation showed, and we are informed that the delegation was led by Taliban Political Commission representative Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, with representatives from the Religious Commission and Publicity Commission alongside. And Baradar said on Wednesday that the Afghan Taliban has full sincerity in realizing peace in the country and is willing to work with every party, note the word every party, to build a political system that is widely accepted by Afghanistan and will protect human rights and the interests of women and children. That is almost exactly what we read in that readout from the Russian Foreign Ministry when the Taliban visited Moscow a short while ago. In both cases, the objective is to establish a broad-based, inclusive government that will provide peace and stability to Afghanistan, and the Taliban are reassuring first the Russians and now the Chinese that that is their objective also. And the Chinese Global Times, very interestingly, then goes on to refer back to the meeting in Moscow. Before the visit to China, a Taliban delegation visited Moscow on July 8th, meeting Kremlin envoy for Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, who expressed concerns about the escalation and tensions in northern Afghanistan. Kabulov also urged the Taliban to prevent them from spreading beyond the country's borders. After returning to the Afghan mainstream politics since US-led troops' withdrawal, the Afghan Taliban chose to first visit Russia and China instead of other countries, two powers that have no sharp conflicts of interest with it. It shows the Taliban attaches great importance to developing ties with the two major countries, and it believes in their influence in helping to rebuild Afghanistan. And those words, Global Times quotes from an official and Chinese expert, Li Wei, who is described as an expert on national security and anti-terrorism at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. And then Global Times goes on to quote Li as saying the following. Li said that Russia, which has learned from history, hopes to keep good ties with parties in Afghanistan, and China, with its consistent stance on Afghanistan being governed by Afghans, has maintained good connections with different forces in Afghanistan. China has always been willing to promote the peace process in Afghanistan, for example, using multilateral mechanisms to encourage peace talks and offering to host intra-Afghanistan talks for the Taliban and the government of China. China could play a better coordinator as it has a smooth and high-level communication with leaders of the Afghan government and the Taliban. And then we go on to learn that from the same article that Sultan Bahin, who is a former Afghan ambassador to China, told Global Times that in the eyes of all Afghans, including the Taliban, China is the most trusted and confident friend and could play a bigger role as a mediator than any other country to promote peace in Afghanistan. And then we come to the other reassurance. So the Taliban have told the Chinese, yes, we want peace. Yes, we want a stable government. Yes, we will pursue an inclusive process. We said that to the Russians earlier in July when we went to Moscow, and now we are repeating these assurances when we're meeting with you in Tianjin. And then they said something else, and this relates again to the question of terrorism and terrorist groups in Afghanistan. When meeting with the Taliban delegation in Tianjin, Wang Yi stressed that ETHEREUM, the East Turkestan Independence Movement, is an international terrorist organization listed by the US Security Council, which poses a direct threat to China's national security and territorial integrity. Cracking down on ETHEREUM is the shared responsibility of the international community. Now, again, this is a fairly clear statement, a piece of advice, warning, instruction, if you prefer, that if Afghanistan does indeed want to enter the family of sovereign nations, if it really does want to integrate itself in the Eurasian system, if it does want Chinese economic and financial aid to rebuild the country, then it must crack down on ETHEREUM. And it must not allow, Afghanistan must not become a sanctuary and a launchpad for terrorist groups like ETHEREUM, which can threaten neighboring states, including China. And then we learn that Baradar, the head of the Taliban delegation, said that the Afghan Taliban will never allow any force to use Afghan territory to endanger China. So that's what the Taliban delegation assured Wang Yi when they met with him in Tianjin. And then Global Times goes on to say that in an interview with This Week in Asia, Taliban spokesman Suhail Shaheen said that the organization sees China as a friend. The Taliban would no longer allow Uyghur separatists some of whom had previously sought refuge in Afghanistan, to enter the country. The Taliban would also prevent Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group from operating there. So we can see that there is, again, a case of the Chinese and the Russians quite clearly working together in order to achieve a stabilization in Afghanistan. They're talking to the Taliban, both of them, and this is clearly coordinated, and they're telling the Taliban, if you want economic help from us, if you want to enter the family of nations, if you want to see a prosperous future for your country, if you want to consolidate your government so that what happened to you when the US attacked you, when the US invaded your country after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, in order to ensure that that never happens again, what you need to do is to establish an inclusive government which brings peace to every part of Afghanistan. And that means that you may have to negotiate, you will have to negotiate with all parties, including parties that are part of the present Afghan government. And in addition, you must absolutely guarantee that you will not allow Afghanistan to become a sanctuary and a launchpad for terrorist groups. And the Taliban are telling the Chinese and the Russians that that is exactly what they're going to do. They're telling the Chinese and the Russians that they are heeding this advice, that they understand this advice, that they are sophisticated people, that they have learned from the past, that they will not pursue rigid sectarian policies in Afghanistan that will keep Afghanistan unstable and dangerous to its neighbors, and that they will certainly not allow Afghanistan to become a launch pad for other terrorist groups, and that they absolutely want to work with the Chinese and with the Russians to integrate Afghanistan, and Afghanistan, which they lead, in the Eurasian states, which is, of course, in the collective interest of all Afghans. And in order to underline and emphasize the point that this is a joint Chinese-Russian initiative, we have that complimentary article in Global Times by Mr. Daniil Bochkov, who, as I said, I presume is Russian, though I am not familiar with him, which then goes into this in considerable detail. And it is entitled, China and Russia Have Aligned Interests to Facilitate Shanghai Cooperation Organization Role for Afghanistan. And the article by Mr. Bochkov in Global Times reads as follows. President Joe Biden's decision on the swift withdrawal of American military forces from Afghanistan by August 31st has had a very different acceptance amongst US politicians. And Beijing and Moscow have also raised vocal criticisms over Washington's decision. Moscow accepts uncertainty around the political and military situation in the aftermath of the US's hasty withdrawal. Foreign Minister Lavrov listed upsurges in terrorism, drug trafficking, and instability spillover to neighboring countries as key threats to regional security. Beijing similarly has reprimanded Washington for being the origin of problems in Afghanistan. China is also concerned that the deterioration of security in Afghanistan may become a thriving ground for terrorist organizations. China and Russia, and this is of course from Mr. Bochkov's article, pursue stability in the region, which borders their territories and acts as an important area for advancing their geostrategic interests. Moscow promotes its regional agenda via its political military connections with the former Soviet republics, with the help of its two military outposts in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Moscow is set to conduct a series of counter-terrorism drills with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan in August-September. This will culminate with a massive Shanghai Cooperation Organization-led joint military anti-terrorism exercise called Peace Mission 2021. Note, China and Russia, because that's the major military powers in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, will both be engaged in this massive joint military anti-terrorism exercise in Central Asia. And then Mr. Bochkov goes on to say, China engages in the region mainly through its economic activities under the Belt and Road Initiative, along with multiple projects. So what Mr. Bochkov is doing in this article is he's showing how the Russians and the Chinese emphasize different roles in coordination with each other and how those different roles complement each other. The Russians emphasize political, military, and diplomatic action. The Chinese emphasize economic action. The Russians are the ones who deploy the troops and the security forces and make sure that the region remains stable. The Chinese come in with the financial investment, the pipelines, the roads, the railways, the harbours, the airports, and all the rest. And the two work together in order to achieve their joint objective. And that it is a joint objective is the point that Mr. Bochkov then goes on to say. Despite some circulating speculations that Russia and China are pursuing different, if not competing, agendas in Afghanistan, the ongoing diplomatic process does not uphold such a claim. As mentioned above, the instruments for Russian and Chinese participation in regional affairs differ, but their interests are mostly aligned and concentrate on cementing peace and stability, preventing the spread of terrorism, extremism, and drug trafficking. Moscow and Beijing facilitate more active role of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a trend spotted by the expert community of Russia and China and highlighted by official statements. So there it is, the Chinese and the Russians working together to try to bring peace to Afghanistan. Will they succeed? Well, as I said before, in that previous program I did about the Russian effort, no one ultimately can say. I mean, Afghanistan is a country that has known a lot of war and a lot of violence. There are many people there, many people in Afghanistan who become accustomed to fighting and for whom fighting has now become a way of life. But at the same time, there must be, for most Afghans, I'm guessing for the great majority of Afghans, a great deal of exhaustion about the fact that their country has been in a state of perpetual war. It may be that this is the moment when a critical mass of Afghans will say enough, and that this is the time to have peace and to rebuild our country. Obviously, we don't want foreign occupiers in our country, be they Russian or American. But now that they're all gone, we want peace in our country. And if that means working with the Russians and the Chinese, well, so be it. And if it also means that we are not perhaps going to pursue the extreme sectarian policies that some of us might have hankered for once, well, so be it also. And as far as these other jihadi terrorist groups, Al Qaeda, ETHEREUM, ISIS are concerned, well, all they've ever done for Afghanistan is bring us misery and pain and suffering and trouble. So we're absolutely happy to promise that they shouldn't come. So perhaps all of this Russian and Chinese activity is going to achieve a successful outcome. I'm going to say this straightforwardly. I think that is what we should all hope for. I am extremely concerned, and I'm becoming extremely aggravated by a whole host of articles which I've recently been reading in both the British and American media, which say that President Biden made a mistake to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan, that keeping US troops in Afghanistan, even small numbers of troops, was perfectly sustainable and entirely possible, that this could have been carried on indefinitely, and that withdrawing these troops somehow betrays all those women in Afghanistan who are going to face terrible retribution if they are withdrawn. And lots of people, the Financial Times, for example, in Britain, has been publishing article after article about this, so has The Guardian, all of them saying that it was a mistake for the United States to withdraw and it should have stayed, and American casualties had been brought down, and this was the best outcome for Afghanistan and for the Afghan people. Well, it is not the best outcome for Afghanistan and the Afghan people if the result of the presence of those US troops in Afghanistan is perpetuation of the war that is currently waging in Afghanistan and which has been ongoing since the 1970s. Peace is the precondition for progress. Progress for women's rights, for women's education, for everything else. War is not only a terrible thing in and of itself, it is also something which absolutely ensures that whatever progress in matters like women's rights or whatever is made is always going to be extremely fragile and open to being reversed at any time. This is an obvious point, and I'm going to say straightforwardly that these people who now bring up the question of the rights of women in Afghanistan in order to try and justify a policy of keeping US troops in Afghanistan indefinitely are not speaking in good faith. It's not the women of Afghanistan who benefit from the presence of those troops. It is the geostrategic policies that these journalists and others advocate, and it is their fear that the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan will mean the defeat of those geostrategic policies. So it is absolutely imperative that the US does withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, giving Afghanistan what Wang Yi correctly said is an opportunity finally to achieve peace. Now, as I said, there is this concern about the fact that there are people in Afghanistan who are now accustomed to war, and it may be difficult to persuade some of them at least to put their arms down and to seek a policy of peace. But there's also the other factor, which is that the United States, whilst apparently not exactly having second doubts about its withdrawal, seems to be looking for more ways to maintain some sort of a presence in Afghanistan, even after it has left. We've had more US bombing raids in Afghanistan over the last few days, and we've also had a rather tart interview from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, which says that the United States, while saying that it is actually leaving Afghanistan, wants to be able to peep over the fence, as he put it, and keep an eye on what goes on in Afghanistan by establishing some kind of presence in neighbouring countries. And Shoigu, as I discussed in another recent programme, made it absolutely clear that the Russians are not prepared to allow that. So it's not just Afghans who might stand in the way of achieving peace. Conceivably, it is some people in the United States also. I still think that this US withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to end with all US troops finally and conclusively out of the country. I also believe that these US attempts to try and maintain some kind of presence in the region are going to fail. And I also believe, though perhaps with less confidence, that the Russian and Chinese initiative to bring peace and stability to Afghanistan will eventually succeed, and that we will see an Afghanistan, albeit an Afghanistan under Taliban leadership, gradually open itself up to the world, integrate itself with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, join the Eurasian institutions, benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative, and enjoy finally the benefits of peace. That, it seems to me, is the optimal outcome now. And we should not allow ourselves to be distracted by phony concerns about the rights of Afghan women that are not really the primary concerns of many of the people who preach them. A policy of peace is always to be preferred to a policy of war. So, are we going to see peace in Afghanistan or not? Well, only time can tell, but it does seem to me that we are closer to that point than we've ever been in before the 1970s. And some people in Russia and China are working very hard to make it happen. Let's hope that they succeed, and let's put aside all our geopolitical obsessions just for a while on this issue to one side. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. And please also check me out on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Cristoforo. And please also don't forget to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Also, please check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU, and especially Locals. And I should say that Alex and I are planning major things, great things, especially for Locals. And I would suggest that you all sign up and wait for what's going to come there and keep an eye out on what we're doing there, because I think you will be impressed when it happens. And also, if you want to support us and our work, then please do so by going to PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. You'll find links under this video. And also, of course, don't forget our shop, the amazing things you will find there, amazing mugs, fantastic t-shirts, superb polo shirts, hats, hoodies, sweatshirts, amazing things. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please remember to press the like button if you have. Please also check your subscription to this channel. And thank you again for joining me today. And I look forward to you joining me again soon. And have a wonderful day until then.